want to talk a little bit about culturally responsive literacy teaching and what that means, what that looks like. And I'm hoping that at this point, you can probably define that without my assistance. So based on the things that we've discussed over the past 3 days, what would you say? Somebody give me a definition of culturally responsive literacy instruction. There you go. That's exactly what it is. So adapting all of these practices, is this okay? I feel like, okay. That we have discussed within the context of literacy. And critical literacy that Dr. Coffey just mentioned plays perfectly into this whole idea of culturally responsive literacy instruction. So what I want to talk about are 7 elements, and I hope that most of these will at least be something you've heard before, if not before this week. Hopefully during this week, 7 elements of a culturally responsive literacy classroom. So we're going to look at what elements go into making a culturally responsive literacy classroom and then strategies associated with each of those elements. So before we move into that, I want to make sure that I debunk some of the myths about culturally responsive teaching and tell you some of the things that culturally responsive teaching is not. So we know that culturally responsive teaching or pedagogy is not this special, fancy package just for students of color. I hope you've gotten the message over these 3 days that culturally responsive, being culturally relevant, using critical literacy is just good teaching skills. So it's not something that we reserve for all of the Latino kids, not something we reserve for our Native American populations, but this is something that works well in white suburban schools or any type of school, as long as you're using these skills and strategies consistently and effectively. So it's not something that's just limited to students of color. And the same is true for teachers. You know, a lot of times teachers hear this idea of being culturally responsive and think that that teachers of color have a special in, because, you know, they already know how to do this. And that's not the case. Some of the most culturally responsive teachers I've encountered are white teachers, and they do a great job. So it's not about your color. And my fellow African Americans in the room can vouch for me that, you know, just because I'm black doesn't give me the automatic in with a black kid. I've still got to build that level of trust with them. And I don't necessarily have it any easier than my white colleagues if I'm not willing to get to know them and make those connections. So it's not necessarily something that is just, it's not a special bag of tricks. We can't, package it all up. And if we could, we can make millions of bucks if we could just put it in a nice, neat package, sell it. And so it's not that. It's not always easy. It's about having to do extra research on your own, going out, finding those texts to supplement what's already there, doing that extra work, but definitely worth it. You also, contrary to popular belief, do not have to have full, complete knowledge of each culture represented in the classroom. So as a culturally responsive teacher in a diverse classroom where you may have Indian American, Native American, Latino populations in the classroom, you don't have to be the end-all, be-all, keeper of all the knowledge about every different culture within the classroom. So you don't have to become the expert on that culture. And many times the kids themselves or even their families aren't experts on their culture. So it's not about that, but it's about making the effort to adapt those things that you're already doing. And then we want to make sure that it's not something that reinforces stereotypes. So Dr. Coffey mentioned this, and as we were looking, you were looking at the text that you're currently using. It's not enough just to say, okay, great, now I'm using texts that have African American characters. I can check that box off. You have to look at the way those characters are being portrayed within the text. And so if the only African American characters that an African American child sees are athletes or cooks or maids, then we're still not doing a good job of accurately representing a particular culture. So it's more than just making that effort to diversify, but looking at how the characters are portrayed. So when we think about what culturally responsive literacy instruction is, I know that you know these things because we've talked about them several times over the course of this week. So getting to know students and how important that is. You know, you want it to be bigger and more than that, but that is one of the easiest ways to begin to develop that classroom community. We talked some when you were with Dr. Hancock and you did some internal reflection and evaluation of yourself. So we have to, as culturally responsive literacy teachers, be willing to acknowledge the biases that we have. And that's not always easy to do. I'm going to force you through some of that in just a minute. We're going to go into some exercises related to that. But it's not always easy to acknowledge the biases that we have. But we have to be willing to do that and look at how our perspective influences what we do as teachers. So because we have those biases, we inherently bring those into the classroom. Not on purpose, not always intentionally, but we do bring those biases into the classroom. So as culturally responsive teaching, it's not about changing who we are. Teachers, it's not about changing who we are, but it's about recognizing and modifying our instruction based on not only us, but the students that we teach. So I want you to do a little bit of reflection. First, think about your own literacy behaviors. So think about the things you do, the way you speak, what you write, maybe books that you read, how that might reflect your cultural background. So are you a member of a book club and all of the members in that book club look just like you, and you read books that are written by authors that look like you? Do the blogs or websites that you have bookmarked on your iPad or your phone or your computer, are they all representative of you? What sort of things do you do within your own personal lives that reflect your culture? What sort of literacy practices do you have that reflect your own culture? So I'll give you an example. I told you that I'm a football girl. So I like to, just in case I didn't mention it. So I get the Panthers football magazine, and that is a reflection of my culture. Not necessarily race, doesn't have anything to do with that, or my gender. In fact, it is, not necessarily something we don't think football women all the time, although that's changing. On the flip side of that, one of the sites that I follow, it's called PhD Sisters, and so Sisters is actually what it is, and so it's all African American female in the academy professors, and so we, there's different. You've rubbed off on me, Heather. Now I can't think of simple words again. Blogs or experiences, memoirs about experiences in the academy. So those are some of the things that I do. On my way here, was listening to African American radio station, Christian radio station. So think about some of the things that you do that kind of reflect your own, and talk about that within your groups. Okay, I'm going to give you one other set of questions that I want you to discuss in your groups, and then we're going to talk about these whole group. I want you to think about ways that your literacy practices are inclusive of others. So do you intentionally, in any of the things that you do, seek to learn about other cultures, or are your own personal, in your day-to-day literacy activities, do they involve other cultures? Do you read books that might reflect? I was in a book club that happened to be, it was made up of professors' wives, and everybody was white in the book club but me. And so the next book that we were going to read was a historical fiction. I can't remember what it was. Totally out of my comfort zone. So my immediate reaction was, I don't want to read that. I don't know. I read the book, loved it, and got completely addicted to that particular genre. So I forced myself to step outside of my own cultural literacy practices in that example. So think about any examples that you might have like that, where you are involved in literacy practices that are not necessarily associated with your culture. So we're going to look at each of these elements, and like I said, hopefully, and this will work well for time, because typically time doesn't work well for us. I'm hoping I can fly through these a little bit faster, because we've hit on most of these elements throughout the discussions that we've had over these past 3 days. So I'm hoping that some of this will be a repeat for you, and that you will join me in the discussion by giving me some of your input. I will defer, and you know that my background is early childhood, and so I'm going to rely on my middle and high school colleagues to help supplement what I have with some examples that you think might be relevant to your context as well. So the first element of a culturally responsive culturally responsive literacy instruction is, what's your point? What's the goal? Why are you doing this, and how do you make that relevant to the student? And we saw in that previous example, Mrs. Swords completely failed at that. So she was attempting to correct what she saw as language that wasn't accurate, but the goal wasn't very clear. And so the student played back and forth, and we're now suspecting, right, Cheryl, that he knew what she wanted, but that he didn't follow through. So how are you making your goals clear, and how are you giving children the opportunity to take ownership within the classroom? And so we've talked about getting to know students, finding out their interests within the classroom and outside of the classroom as one strategy to become culturally responsive. And that same strategy works well when we think of literacy instruction. And so at the bottom of each of these slides, I put just one strategy. As we get to the end, I'm going to have you come up with additional strategies that you think might be relevant. So you can't steal mine, but I want you to think of others that we might be able to associate with each element of the culturally responsive literacy classroom. So has anyone ever used interest inventories before in the classroom? Again, something that I think works with a variety of contexts. I've seen the ones in your pre-K where the kids, you read the question to the kid and they circle the happy face if they agree with it or the sad face if they don't. And then all the way up through high school. I put an example, and I'll put this one out. I'll put this one in the Dropbox of a student interest inventory. This one they said was middle school, but I think this one would work. I think throughout, in obviously young elementary, you might have to help the students, but this is all things that you can not necessarily use specifically within your instruction, but things that can help cue you into where the students are and why their behaviors may be the way that they are. Some of the scenarios you looked at with Dr. Parikh Fox, where you remember the case studies, and you were looking at the students without having the background knowledge of what's going on. Something like this could give you that. So, who are the adults that live with me? Brothers and sisters, special friends, what I like to do at home, things about school. My all-time favorites: candy, movie, song, music groups. Yesterday we were looking at Kim's lesson plan and talking about using writing word, or was that you, Torian? Somebody was saying using math word problems that incorporate some of the things that the students. So just a simple interest inventory like this can allow you to look at some of the things that are going on in the children's lives and incorporate that into your literacy instruction in terms of the. Yeah. And then they will begin to write problems and incorporate themselves, so it's a good engagement. Yes. That came up in the group yesterday as well. What other ways do you incorporate students' interest into something simple like that, into a word problem? Okay, so the second element of a culturally responsive literacy classroom or culturally responsive literacy instruction is related to the student's home language. So when we look back at that second scenario that I provided you with, where Mrs. Swords was attempting to get the student to speak using standard American English, was she allowing space for that student's home language? And so we need to incorporate skills or strategies that don't demean students' home language, but create a space for that, and so that students are aware of when it's appropriate to use their home language and when it's not. So again, think back to what I said about her ultimate goal. Even though she didn't communicate it clearly, she wanted the best for the student. She wanted the student to speak what is standard American English. But one of the things that we find in the research is that just what you saw in the next day that happens with this what is more or less a corrective approach to teaching language, it doesn't work. Elementary folks, how many of you attempt to do that with your students? That makes it. How many of you try and help them by correcting their language in a similar way? Does anybody attempt to make? Yeah, it's not a bad thing. Yeah, right. And that's a much better approach than what she did. So modeling it in the right way. Any middle school? Do we have middle? Yeah, we have middle. That's right. Do you see the same things in terms of language? High school? So what's happening? Because we know the elementary, the early childhood folks, we're trying, we're making attempts. But then they're going to middle school, they're doing the same thing. Then they get to high school, and we still see these language patterns within their speech. And because it's when we look at the research on it, this corrective approach that teachers take is unsuccessful. It doesn't work because what's missing is that connection piece, that's showing how what you're saying relates to that standard American English. And so I've told you that we're going to do a little bit more of an in-depth look at code switching and how it can be used effectively. So we're going to look at this approach, which is called contrastive analysis. So a contrastive analysis is a form of code switching that puts that student's language side by side with the way it would be spoken in standard American English. And so it's not just that we're saying to you, oh, that's wrong. Let me show you the right way to do it. What we're saying to them is that we're showing them a way that you do it in this particular scenario. Because you don't want to send the message that your language is all wrong, so let me just fix it and show you how to say it the right way. Especially with the younger babies, because what you say to them when you say, no, you know that's not the right way to say that. They're thinking, well, that's how my mama says it, and that's how my grandma says it, and Miss Susie down the street, she says it that way too. So you're telling them everyone in their community is wrong, and they're wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. And so just be mindful of the way we're communicating that to them. One of the first mini lessons that I used to do in elementary school, and I think could work well in middle and high school context as well, is to just do a simple T-chart. Here's where we can use our home language. Here's situations where we need to use our school language. On the playground, Miss Glover doesn't care. On the playground, you can talk, you can use your home language within, no bad words. In the cafeteria, in small groups. But when we get ready to do our writing, we're going to switch. We're going to switch over so that they know that there are appropriate situations, but not necessarily right versus wrong. So we have to be mindful of the way we communicate that to students. And so we're going to do a little example. Before we do, though, I'm going to challenge you. Remember, I told you that I would challenge you. We're going to challenge you. When we talked a little bit about your own biases. So I want you to be honest with yourself. You don't have to say anything out loud. I want you to be honest with yourself, though, about some of your own biases in terms of speech and language. So we've all watched the news. We've heard people retelling stories that happened on the news, or we've watched movies and we've seen how people are portrayed. I'll go back to I'll put myself out there, my biases. So I'm again football girl. I listen to sports radio, and there's a sports radio station here in Charlotte, and people call in. And they are very Southern in their speech when they call in. And, for the first year that I listened to the radio, I was like, why do they always get, these people, not everybody in Charlotte talks like this. Why do they get, but then I had to step back and think, well, if 80% of the people that call in speak with a Southern drawl, maybe we do. So here's my challenge. How many of you are not from the South? I know that we have lots of, okay. So, those of you who are not from the South, before you moved to the South and met all of us nice Southern people, what were some of your thoughts? You don't have to share them out loud, but you can if you want to. What were your thoughts about people in the South? Based on some of there you go. What else? Mm-hmm. That's what we do. It's true. Milk sandwich. Milk and bread for our dusting of snow. What else did you think? So sometimes these conceptions, these biases, and they're not always negative. You think people from from other parts of the country may come here, and you've seen movies and all the movies about the South. People have chickens in the yard and goats, and you come, and so you think that there may be this sort of backwards mindset, which might be more of a negative perception. But on the other hand, like Kim's saying, you think, oh, they're sweet. Dr. Glass, her husband is a major talker. He will talk to the wall. We go places and he meets people. He just talks. But he's a really big guy. He's a big black guy, and so that can be scary and alarming to some people if this big black guy just starts talking to you. But he's from Tennessee. So he has this southern drawl. So the minute he opens his mouth and he said something, you can see people kind of relax. They're like, oh, he's safe. He's a big, and so it's just the same thing. It's still a bias. It happens to be a positive one of people in the South, but they sort of kind of breathe and let back and like, okay, I can talk to him. And you remember the example that Dr. Hancock gave where he was talking about running and having when he had his dreadlocks. You can't imagine that, can you? Him with locks, but yeah. So we have these biases and these things that we do, and I'm not trying to erase that, but I just want us to be aware of it, and as it relates to our students and also their parents.